When did your ghost stories actually begin? And under what circumstances did they begin as well?
Oh, this is really interesting. I was doing a play with two very talented people in Prague. It was written and directed by two very talented people, Jeff and Mel. And it was called Cabaret Macabre. And we were playing vampires, and it was written all about these fables. Jeff is an amazing writer. Like, if we ever need help writing our story, we'll go to Jeff. And he was working as a ghost tour guide with Hannah, which I didn't really know at the time when I met him. I was just part of this acting crew. And Jeff had needed to switch jobs out, so he was mentioning something. He mentioned something in passing, like, oh my god, I need to find a replacement, otherwise Hannah's, like, gonna kill me, for this ghost tour program. So I said, oh, that's interesting, what is it? And does she need people who speak Czech, da-da-da-da? And he was like, no, you're perfect, I'm gonna give her your contact information.
Okay.
So I followed him on a tour, just to see if I would like it, and it basically goes all the way around Old Town Square in Prague. Well, Old Town Square in basically Prague 1, all of, like, the oldest parts of Prague. And then we were the only ghost tours that went into the underground torture chambers in Prague, which is an amazing experience. These underground cellars right underneath the Orloj. If you've ever been to Prague in Old Town Square, there's an Orloj, which is the big astrological clock that is on a lot of pictures. Right underneath that is this place that was meant, it's where it starts, it's where one of the places starts, one of the entrances to these, like, labyrinth of tunnels, most of which are closed off now. But it was originally meant as a wine cellar in, like, I think it's like the 10th or 11th, we'll have to check those details, century. And when the government actually saw what this was, they're like, oh, actually, no, we need some space for torture chambers, so we're going to take this from you and make it into torture chambers.
So they're at least hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
Torture chambers.
Oh,
okay.
yeah, hundreds.
Okay.
Hundreds of years old. And when they were first built, they weren't as underground as they are now, but due to years and years of people just throwing their garbage on the streets and flooding, they had to build the city up about 8 meters because of so much compiled garbage, and because of the Vltava River flooding, they had to build it up. So the city's been built up about 8 feet since those torture chambers were first built. You have the tours that we used to do. There was 2 sides to it. There was the Gothic side and then the Romantic side, and it was the Romantic side because of the era in which it was built. I always used to joke about that. And you got 2 very different types of spirits in each side of the torture chambers. I would bring all sorts of international groups in there, ranging from, like, 3 people to, like, 50, and depending on the night.
And when did you start, and when did you generally finish?
I would start around 6 o'clock, and we'd end around 9, sometimes 10 or 11.
Okay.
I did these, this was kind of, it started off as, like, just kind of a side job, because I was doing so many different things at that point. I was bartending at Hard Rock Cafe, which was part of the tour. It was very haunted. That building's very haunted as well. Everything's haunted in Prague. You can't have that much history and not have a haunted area. I was bartending at Hard Rock Cafe. I was doing the Bear Educational Theater, so we were touring all around. I was doing auditions, I was a casting assistant, and I was a ghost tour guide, all at that very same time. That was a very busy period of my life. So I started off, I learned the tours very quickly. Actually, everything just sort of came to me. I didn't even memorize the script. I remember just every story I told was about a certain spirit, except for a couple. And everyone that had a spirit attached to it, the stories just came to me naturally because I know now that I was sort of channeling those spirits. Whereas the stories that were just about an area and not really surrounding the spirits, it was harder for me to memorize because there was no spirit to help me along with the story. So Jeff, I actually noticed when I was first, I noticed it, looking back now I saw it when Jeff was leading the tour too. He kind of, especially when we got into the torture chambers, his eyes kind of went a different color and he would speak in a little bit of a different voice. And he would get more emotional than he normally was. I didn't know what that was at the time, but now I understand it's because he was literally linking with the spirits down there and telling their story as they wanted it to be heard. Because I would say details that were not in the script and I had never heard of, but I knew they were true. And if I looked them up later, they were true or there was references to them. I would also talk about stuff that nobody else could know except for these spirits. There was 2 spirits down in the torture chambers that I was exceptionally attached to. One was Jan Midlarz, who's the executioner, and the other is Dorota, or Dorothy, kind of his love, who I don't think she was buried or killed down there, but she was down there. There were a bunch of different kind of spirits. There was a pit where they used to starve people and people used to cannibalize each other. That was crazy. Literally, if I had less than 3 people, or 3 people, like less than 5 people on my tour, I wouldn't go near that pit because people would look down into it, and when they looked up, it was as if they were possessed sometimes. There was times I felt very uncomfortable with some people down in there. Mm-hmm. I would also immediately know who was a doctor on my tour. I could point them out as soon as, I wouldn't know at first, but when we went down into the torture chambers, as soon as I told the first story, then I'd point to to these people and be like, are you a doctor? Are you a doctor? And are you a doctor? And they'd all say yes all the time. And that's because the 28 men that were killed, one of them was a doctor, and so was Jan Midlarz. She was studying to become a doctor. The executioner was studying to be a doctor. So he had a great sort of empathy and connection to people who were actually healers.
But he was an executioner.
He was the executioner through certain circumstances that arose. Okay. Do you want me to tell you the story? Okay, so Jan Midlarz was a very smart young man who was growing up in a small town in the Czech Republic. He had a very strong connection to this one woman who he was going to marry, called Dorota. And he got accepted to Charles University in Prague. And he had to go away and leave Dorota there in the village for a couple of years, but said, I'll be back when I graduate and we'll get married. Now, while he was there studying, Dorota became pregnant back in the village. And they say that it was because she was just, like, unfaithful to him, but I believe that she was, put under circumstances where she couldn't resist. Whether she was raped or whether it was because she was told that Jan was dead, I'm not sure. But anyway, she got pregnant and had a baby, and she was forced to marry this guy that was the alleged father, who was a wealthy old nobleman who was quite abusive.
And this is while Jan was in love with her?
This is while they loved each other, and he was studying in Prague. Okay. Dorota was back in the village, and she was studying. She became pregnant through this nobleman. They say that Dorota fell into kind of a depression while she was pregnant and had forced to be married to this guy. And 3 days after her baby was born, it was found dead in the crib. And then a couple of days later, her husband was found dead in his bed. This was never ever scientifically confirmed, but they accused her of poisoning both her baby and her husband. And they sentenced her to death. And Jan Midlarz didn't want this to happen, so he raced back to his hometown and tried to rescue her. Now, there was no way he could get her out. He tried to bribe every man in the village or any judge, jury, authority. He tried to pay people to get her out of there, and he couldn't. Time was running low before she was to be killed. So he did the only thing he knew. He did what he had to do. Is basically he approached the executioner and said, I want to become an executioner. Now, the executioners in Europe, it's like a lineage, basically. So these people were completely ostracized from society. They had to live near the dump. They had their own entrance to the church. They had 1 or 2 places they could go shop for food. They had one area in one bar in the town where they could sit, and a couple glasses they could drink from. If they touched you, if I was an executioner, I touched you, you were now condemned to death. You were ostracized from society. So this was a very serious thing. By becoming an executioner, by even handling one of his tools, by interacting with him, Jan Midlarz was completely ostracizing himself from society. But he did it because he wanted to save Dorota. Now, he was very, very skilled because he was becoming... he was studying to become a doctor, so he knew the human anatomy very well. He knew how to inflict pain, and he also knew how to cure it. So this was actually very handy when they really needed to torture people for long periods of time but keep them alive. He would torture them and then sew them back up, basically. So, of course, he progressed very, very quickly. He had a knack for it, and within a couple days he was given the keys to the dungeon. And he went down there to rescue Dorota. in the middle of the night. And so he unlocked the cage, surprised her, and he took her away into the tunnels where they meant to escape, but they got lost. So they were starving. They were down there for like 3 or 4 days. And they were starving, and eventually the dogs that they had sent out after them found them, and the guards found them too. So they were both locked up side by side. And Jan Midlarge basically had to listen while they walled her up alive. That was her sentence after trying to escape. They just walled her up alive and left her to die. And he had to listen as she cried for help and screamed for him and begged for mercy. And after she was dead, they opened his cellar and said, you have 2 choices. You can stay here and rot, or you can become an executioner. You can do what you've decided to do already. So he decided to become an executioner. And at first he started out in that small town, but he was the best. So eventually he was made, very quickly, he became the youngest executioner in the history of the Czech Republic to be the main executioner in Prague, which was one of the highest honors you could get as an executioner. And he also, this guy was really revolutionary as an executioner because he became almost revered by the people and well respected. Like, it was the first time that the people would actually even interact with the executioner. They called him by his first name rather than just executioner. They called him, they would nod to him on the street. Some people would bring food and leave it for him. This was like unheard of, and he was known to be like as kind as possible in his process. He was one of the only executioners who would sharpen his axes or anything before taking people's heads off, which seems like such a small thing now, but like executioners back in those days were known to like take people's heads off with like a rusty blunt blade, which makes for a much more painful death rather than a sharpened clean axe. So things like that he became very well respected for.
Well, that sounds like quite the story.
Yeah, and he also started a little medical business on the side. Like, he wanted to use his skills to heal people. He was really like a tortured soul in that way. He wanted to heal people. So the poor in Prague never had like a medical system. The medical system there was awful. So in the middle of the night, people would bring their hurt and wounded to his office, basically, which was in the like old town square, kind of underneath. In secret, they bring him there, and he'd do remedies. He'd set broken bones. He'd give them like basic rudimentary remedies for colds and flus, medicine that they'd pretty much otherwise die without, but was very simple for him to provide.
Okay, now we're going to go back onto how this spirit affected you when you're down underneath in the catacombs. So you talked about the history of the spirit.
Yeah.
You talked about knowing the spirit and having a connection to it. Now you're going to talk to me about what happened with the spirit while you were on your ghost tours.
He was always kind of my protector. When I was down, it's very interesting in those tunnels, because those spirits, especially when you're new, especially somebody like me who's an empath going down there, I was like a free lunch, and I knew that going down, so I was employing like certain techniques I knew on how to shield myself. I was like...
And a beautiful free lunch.
Yeah, thanks. So I could feel like them testing me. It was almost like, like when you're being initiated into a gang or a mafia or something, they're going to test you, and if they can take advantage of you, that's all it's going to be. They're going to take advantage of you and run you through and wear you out. But if they're like, oh, and you don't budge, and you're like a little bit stronger, they'll come to respect you in some way, but it's some sort of balance. So I think Midlarge, the first couple times I came down and told his story, I always felt something kind of at the back of my tour, like leading everybody through. Like, I was at the front, and then this would be at the back. And my friend Ken came on me my first couple tours to make sure I was okay. Like shit goes down, I'll be here for you. And he would be at the back, and he told me he felt some sort of spirit too, kind of trailing, like the caboose, kind of trailing farther behind, sort of watching. And eventually he would sort of move further and further on my tours until he was by my side all the time. And then he kind of became my protector. Like, nothing really bothered me on those tours while I was down there when he was around. So he would always be by my right-hand side. I could feel him kind of being like, I think he's karmatically bound to that place. Like, he can't really leave. He's got to keep everybody in line down there. And so I could feel him down there being like, just sort of clearing a path for us to go through, like, sort of unharmed and unbothered. However, if I think he regarded me more as like a shepherd with my flock sort of thing. Not to make it sound religious, but like I was the leader of these tour groups and I knew what was up, so even more than all the other tour guides, I was responsible to make sure that these people were respectful and like stayed in line down there and stayed together. So we had a couple tours where people were trying to get stuff riled up, like not even trying, but some sort of misguided psychics or misguided mediums or just kids who... We had a couple, like, really strange kids down there who would try to get stuff riled up, and he would get angry at me. He'd be like, yo, get your stuff in line, like, get it together, woman. I was boxed on the ears by him a couple times, pushed up against the wall by him. And it was very also strange because one time, I remember this was the strangest, weirdest tour that I was ever part of. I had like a bunch of little German girls. Like, they were like 15, 16, 14, some of them. All beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German girls on this tour. They were part of a school. They were like a dance group or something. And I was like, oh god, this is going to be interesting because it was like a torture chamber full of men, basically. They hadn't seen a woman in centuries, you know, like in this. And so I expected to have trouble from the other spirits, but when we got into the romantic side of the torture chamber, as I was telling my story, we all heard this whisper, like this voice. Every single person in the tour heard it, like it was this constant whisper. And then this wind came through, and it was very unsettling, and I basically was like, Midlarge, are you around? And he was nowhere to be, like, seen or heard or whatever. Well, he was right there, he was the voice. He had totally gone into this other, like, personality and, like, almost predatory with these girls. So I don't know if it reminded him of Dorota or what was going on, but it was like, oh, Midlarge likes little German girls.
Did they get scared or what happened to them?
We got them out of there pretty quick because we all heard it. It was like, it wasn't like one or two people heard it and was like, okay, time to get out. It was like everybody. And the girls, like, stopped me because I was trying to ignore it at first. But then I saw them looking between each other and, like, wondering with those wondering looks, like, do you hear that too? And then one girl was like, I think we all hear this. And everybody was like, yep. And I was like, do you girls want to go? And everybody was like, yeah. So we got right out of there.